Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we tackle a single relevant question based on our Bible reading for that day. This week, our reading is centered around the book of Mark. Today I'm joined by Rexroad and Sheryl Daughety. So we're going to dive into our question from our reading of Matthew 9:33 through 37 today. And I'll read that passage. It says, after they arrived at Capernaum and settled in a house, Jesus asked his disciples, "What were you discussing out on the road?" But they didn't answer because they had been arguing about which of them was the greatest. He sat down and called the 12 disciples over to him and said, "Whoever wants to be first must take last place and be the servant of everyone else." Then he put a little child among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said to them, "Anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf welcomes me, and anyone who welcomes me welcomes not only me, but also my Father who sent me." So Jesus says, if anyone wants to be first, whoever wants to be first must take last place or be last and be a servant of everyone else. I really have two questions here, and I guess they're connected, but I'm going to ask them separately. Is it okay to want to be first?
I think with many people, not all people, it's a natural drive or desire, especially when it comes to like competition. And I grew up in a generation where it was really pushed on you to be the best. But then you got the participation generation.
I don't know. I feel like there's a big difference between wanting to do your best and always wanting to be first. I mean, being first often means that you're pushing everybody else out of your way.
When I read this, and I've gone back and read it multiple times, and this story is kind of in other Gospels, so it's not just here. Because in some places, people condemn the desire to be first or best or in front or whatever. You shouldn't want that. But that's not what he says. He says, if you want it, the way to get there, the right way to get there, is to do it this way. And so because later Paul would write things about spiritual gifts. Like, it's okay to desire spiritual gifts, even gifts like leadership or, apostleship. It's okay to desire those gifts.
But you better be ready to use it.
That's right. Mm-hmm. There are things that come along with that. And so he says, if you want to be first, this is the right way to do it. So the second question that I have is, how do we become last? Because he says the last shall be first. If you want to be first, you got to be last. So how do you become last? It's not. You weren't here, but you were on staff at the time. We did a book called Leaders Eat Last, by Simon Sinek. But it's not just as simple as letting everybody go in front of you in line. That's oversimplification. So what does it mean to be last? How, as the leader, do you go last? And does it literally mean last?
I think there's a combination of obedience and putting others before yourself, having that kind of a posture, and kind of looking at what you had just said. I kind of wanted, like, the idea, instead of being first, I wonder if it means a little bit more of like, if you want to be elevated in the eyes of Christ, that you need to go and take on this posture, which he showed us, right? When he washed the disciples' feet. I mean, he took the lowest position out of all of them.
Yeah, and it's multifaceted, because you can't wake up and say, I'm not going to be selfish anymore. I'm going to put everybody else in front of me, because you're not going to be able to do that on your own will.
Right.
The more time that you spend with God and the more obedient you are to the shaping of who you are and what you desire in your life as a result of His will, the more naturally that is going to happen because you become more concerned with what's going on in other people's lives than you do in your own. And I also think a lot of that comes with trust. The more time you spend with him, the more you understand how much he loves you and the more you trust him with your life. And so the less worrying you're doing about how am I going to be provided for? Am I going to get what I think I deserve? Am I going to get what I need? Because I think you find that you will.
If you're overly concerned about the position instead of, honestly, just whatever needs to be done, then I think your motives are wrong. Mm-hmm. If your goal is, okay, I'm going to do what's in the best interest of everybody involved. As a parent, we're all parents. As a parent, there are times when the family's needs go ahead of our own personal desires or wishes. Now, that doesn't mean we don't ever go first, or we don't ever get what we want, or we don't ever get our way. That's not what that means. But the good of the family has to be what's ultimately most important. And those are the most successful parents, are the ones who think in terms of, okay, what's best for the family unit, not just what's best for me or my ego.
Or the individual child.
Yes.
Who wants to be on top, you know?
Yeah. And I think that can be a challenge at times with us because we think in terms of position, title, influence, recognition. And it's not that any of those things are wrong. It's not wrong that you have a title. It's not wrong that you have a position. It's not wrong that you have influence. It's not wrong that you have recognition. But if those are the motives for which we work, I had an interaction with a gentleman one time, and I was introducing him to my wife, and I said, and I called him by his first and last name, and he said, it is Doctor. And he said, my dad spent a lot of money for me to be a doctor, and I expect people to call me that. With stuff like that just needles me, and so I'm going to needle it. And I've never called him that since then, Doctor. I will refuse to call him Doctor just for principle of it. But there are people who they put so much stake in that title or that position or that recognition. And that is the thing they're striving for, not, okay, what can I do? So there's this term I hear in culture called servant leadership. They're a servant leader. And I hear John Maxwell say frequently, he said, if you're not a servant leader, you're not a leader. So we shouldn't just call somebody. You can't have servant leaders and leaders. Either they're a leader that is a servant leader, or they're not a leader. Right? It's not one of the two. They may have positional influence. They may have achieved a position, and usually they flame out very quickly. They arrive at this place, they get a title, and something happens. They disappear because other things haven't been developed well enough. And I think that what Jesus is saying is not recognition is wrong, not title is wrong, not position is wrong, not even being first is wrong, but to get to first, you've got to think about somebody besides yourself. It can't just be about you. Can y'all think of an instance where you saw someone consumed with, you don't have to give their name, and it might be public. I don't know. It might be some public story you can think of. One's not coming to my mind right this minute, where their whole goal was in the end to be, I can think of a couple all of a sudden now that I'm here. So, Tiger Woods, from the time that kid was probably 2 or 3 years old, his dad had one goal for him: to be a professional golfer, to be the best golfer in the world. And he was. he was the best golfer in the world. But along the way, some other things were not developed that were more important than his golfing skills that cost him dearly, even still cost him today, in some ways. And his legacy will be tainted by some of those other instances that were not developed in him, because the ultimate goal was for him to be number one, and wasn't the character to support it there.
Well, I mean, and I can think of pastors who are going to be remembered the same way, because it seemed like they were much more concerned with notoriety,
and still are.
And
I can think of one in particular right now.
It's unfortunate because of the influence they did actually have, but then because it was for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, I can think of one right now that crashed and burned, and they're on the upswing again. But when I read and listen to them talk, and I'm like, you are still the same, And somebody's going to say I'm being judgmental right now, but this is just, that's how I see it. Okay. This particular person that I'm thinking about is a gym rat, and they're not far from my age, but their body looks different than mine. I'm not a gym rat. And he did a baptism the other day, and he's got on a tight tank top. I started to say wife beater, but that's just a slang term. That's not what you're supposed to call it.
But we know what you're talking
about. Yeah, you knew what I was talking about. A tight, and he's baptizing people in the church, and it was, for me, having watched it and been fairly up close to the situation, I'm like, this right here, right? It's not that wearing a tight tank top is a sin, but it is. I want to show everybody what I'm rolling with, and I'm going to have a wet T-shirt contest up here baptizing everybody, and it's that whole personality, and that particular one I'm thinking about. And if something don't change, there's going to be another crash and burn. Like, it's going to.
And the danger in that right there is he's drawing the attention away from what's actually going on, right? The important thing right there. You shouldn't put yourself out in front of all of that. Well, I've seen almost kind of in the opposite direction. There is one person, I can't speak 100% for the person, but Francis Chan, I was really impressed to see that what he did, where he saw that he was rising up to a point of where people were coming to his church just because of him. And at a certain point, I don't know if it was he realized this or some people were talking to him, but he actually stepped away from the mega church that was developing because it was becoming so focused around him. And he took off and did some other things as far as around the world, and then starting like small group churches and stuff like that, because he didn't want it to be focused around him. And I think he admitted at one point that he could really kind of tell that he himself was getting like a big head with the people that were around him and everything, and he countered it by kind of walking away from it so that the people would be going to church for the right reasons.
Unfortunately, a lot of pastors keep coming to my mind.
Don't look at me.
I'm not looking at you. I mean, because I have so many friends in different school districts, I can think of people who have been in leadership that seem to be a lot more concerned about how things look from the outside than how how they were being perceived as the leader, as opposed to how things were actually functioning on the inside. And it doesn't. People pay the price for it.
Yeah, I think in terms of integrity and credibility, are you trying to create a perception, or are you actually trying to create a culture? And there's a difference, or trying to do what's right, and does it matter? One of the greatest examples that I can think of somebody doing it the right way that's held in pretty high esteem would be Mother Teresa.
Mm-hmm.
You know, she just had a heart to serve. She was, while she was living, one of the most influential people in the world.
Mhm.
Every head of state wanted to meet with her
Mhm.
and, you know, connect with her.
And she was very matter of fact too.
Right.
Mhm.
But she did it for the right reasons, the
Mhm.
right way. She didn't set out. Her goal was not to be first. Her goal was to serve people, which helped her get first.
But because of the way that she served, it was considered very radical
Right.
Mhm.
That's right.
because most people don't.
Approach life that way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue our conversation around the book of Mark.